So ladies, here's another message for you here. I call this one responsibility. And it's taken primarily from the book of Amos, that's in the Old Testament, chapter 5, verses 18 through 24. And just a real quick overview, Amos was a minor prophet in the Old Testament, not because his message was any less relevant than, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah, but really because his book was a lot shorter. And Amos lived in the 700s, that is 700 BC, and he was born into the southern kingdom of Judah, but his message was primarily aimed at the northern kingdom of Israel. And Amos preached towards the end of the northern kingdom of Israel's sovereignty as a country. And so I think for the most part, some of the people that he was preaching to, life had gotten hard for them. And they looked at the day of the Lord as a way out. Sort of like people today look at the second coming of Christ as a way out for their trials and tribulations. And what's so interesting, seriously, if you read this passage, right, Amos 5, verses 18 through 24, is that Amos gets on the people about crying out for the day of the Lord. He says, why are you doing that? Because that's not going to be a time of light. That's going to be a time of darkness. And I guess in contemporary terms, I've always thought the same thing for people that cry out for the second coming of Christ. They look at it as a time of relief. But the point of the matter is that the time leading up to that, as far as Christ was concerned in Matthew 24, and of course in the book of Revelation, and even some of the things that Paul would say in the epistles, is going to be very horrible and difficult for believers. I mean, Jesus said that during that time, during his second coming, or, the day of the Lord, that the sun and the moon would not give their light anymore, and that the stars would fall from the sky. He talked about unparalleled tribulation for believers, and that if those days in fact were not shortened, that even the elect would be deceived if that weren't possible. And so I guess for me, I've never wished for the day of the Lord. I've never wished for the second coming of Christ. I hope I do not live during that time, because it will be an unbelievable event, and one that will usher in unbelievable amounts of suffering. And so with that said, returning to what Amos says in chapter 5, verses 18 through 24, and I encourage both of you to read it, I think really what he's trying to tell his people is this, and this is the message: accept responsibility. Life is hard. You made choices. You have to live with those choices. And I think that's what we have to do. Obviously, we cry out to the Lord and ask him for help in the various trials and tribulations that we experience. But nonetheless, I think the message here is accept responsibility. Step up to the plate. No matter how difficult it is, cry out to the Lord, but accept responsibility. And I think many of the people in the Northern Kingdom weren't really willing to do that. And so that's really more or less, at least for me, this is my take on this passage, what Amos is trying to tell his people. Don't cry out for the day of the Lord. It's not going to be a great time, but cry out rather that God can sustain you in the lives that he's given you. And that's, I think, what we have to take away from this passage. Well, that's about all I have to say. God bless you both.